Preparing live stream to webinar.
All right, I see that the live stream has started, but it's not showing this screen here.
Preparing live stream to webinar.
Actual page.
Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us for the Emergency Rental Assistance Request for Information webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a number of different presenters today to walk you through the program and the requirements and the RFI process itself. And so we're going to do a quick rundown of the agenda for today's webinar, and then we'll do some introductions. So first of all, we're going to do a very brief ERA program and funding overview that also includes our goals, vision, and values for this work. We'll give you some technical assistance and information around the RFI process. We will also outline some of the upcoming engagements and other ways to stay connected to this work as we learn more. And then we will wrap up with an informal question and answer session where you all will have a chance to ask us specific questions. I do want to mention that there will be an FAQ that is posted to our ERA webpage, and that link is in these slides. We will be posting these slides and the link for the recording on YouTube after the presentation. So that will be available to all of you at the end of this. And we also want to caveat some of the information here is ever changing. And so as we learn more from Treasury and as they release their official guidance, we will continue to update our network and our partners on those specific requirements and any changes to the guidelines that may be different than what we're sharing today. So with that, I would like to just do a quick panel introduction. So I'll start. My name is Laura Lean, Assistant Director for Homeless Services at the Oregon Housing and Community Services Agency, the state of Oregon. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Andrea.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Bell. I am the Director of Housing Stabilization at Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Perfect. Thanks.
It is good.
Hello, Laura. I think you were passing it to me. I'm Margaret Salazar. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. Glad to be with all of you this morning.
And I will pass it to Sam.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Kenny. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Homeless Services Policy Analyst at Oregon Housing and Community Services.
We'll go ahead and go with Sandra.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandra Flickinger. I'm the Assistant Director of Procurement and Grant Compliance at OHCS.
And last but certainly not least, Megan.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, this is Megan Bolton. I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Analysis at Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Okay, thank you so much. And we're going to jump into the program overview. So I will send it over to Director Bell to walk us through these next couple of slides.
Thank you for that, Laura. And good morning again. It's good to be with each of you in virtual community this morning. There's going to be a lot of information shared today, and just to sort of start us off and level set, we do have existing rental assistance resources that are currently available through Oregon Housing and Community Services. Today, we're going to talk about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which is a federal resource that we are receiving directly from United States Treasury. Just for a bit of overview of what you have on your screen here. To start, we have the supporting tenants accessing rental resources, the STAR program. So this is a tenant-based resource that will be available in the coming days. Moving to the next item that you see on your screen, we have the Landlord Compensation Fund program. This is, again, a resource that is being administered through our agency, through our Affordable Rental Housing Department. Again, landlords really initiate that process, which is unique from the other programs that you'll see that you'll hear about today, which is really specifically for tenant-based rental assistance. And with that, we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first question is, what is the ERA, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program? You'll hear a lot of detail about really the program details, the program mechanics, and of course the OHCS vision for this program. But nationally, the U.S. Treasury allocated $25 billion specifically to assist households that are unable to pay rent and utilities due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is worth noting that this is a distinct and very different program than the CRF, the Coronavirus Rental Relief Assistance that was provided, that was administered by our agency in March. So this is a specific allocation. Grantees will use these funds to provide assistance to eligible households through newly created rental assistance programs. So this is a surge of new one-time resources coming directly from Treasury to Oregon Housing and Community Services to administer. Next slide, please. So the next question is more around our process. So why take an RFI approach? Well, to start is we will be moving at an unprecedented and really unparalleled speed to make sure that we can deploy these services both with highly administrative ease, with flexibility as allowable within the U.S. Treasury guidelines, but also as we've learned, housing is healthcare, and that is even more true as the COVID-19 impact and the economic fallout has continued to disproportionately impact our communities of color. We also know while it is a good problem to have a surge of resources, we also know that this means a lot for our providers and our stakeholders really working hard at the local level to make sure these resources are available to Oregonians statewide. We've chose to take this RFI process to really understand and assess the capacity of providers statewide so that we can know who is both willing and interested to allocate these resources, but most importantly, how the state can support our providers in having effective rental assistance programs. So right now, as you heard Laura mention, we're still waiting for guidance from Treasury, but here's what we do know is the time is now is to prepare and plan for implementation as quickly as we can. OHCS has really taken some time to reflect on the rental assistance programs that we've administered, our approach, all of the administrative details with that to really both reflect on lessons learned and take those into this new emergency rental assistance opportunity that we have. We have a clear vision ahead, and that is what we are proceeding forward with. You'll hear more about that vision from Director Salazar next. And so with that, I will pass it to Margaret Salazar.
Thank you so much, Director Bell. So let me just take a few moments to talk about the vision and values for this resource. And the first thing I wanted to make sure that folks understand is that as Director Bell mentioned, we did receive dollars in 2020 through Treasury, through the Coronavirus Relief Program, which then passed through our state legislature. And there were some parameters around those dollars, but it was relatively hands-off. There wasn't a lot of statutory oversight on the program requirements for using those funds. This is a different situation. The statute, which was passed by Congress on December 21st of 2020, has a lot of detail on how this program is to operate. There are a great deal of requirements. I encourage folks to take a look at those. But this is a lot of complexity in program design and monitoring that we will be accountable for. So I just wanted to kind of give that context as well, building on what Director Bell stated. So there are some very clear parameters in statute on what these programs need to look like, but there are some decision points for us. And so we wanted to put forward our vision and values. So the first one is, it is critical that there is an ease of application for tenants who need assistance, both paying rent and utilities, to make it as easy as possible for folks to access that assistance. That's making clear what door they go into, how they access the dollars, who they work with, to make sure that that's crystal clear for folks. And that we have a low barrier in terms of what we're requiring for documentation for residents to be able to seek these resources. So our vision here and our values is to make this easy to access. I will note that we're still waiting for final guidance from US Treasury in terms of what kind of tenant income documentation will be required for the program, but our hope is that we will be able to have a light touch there. The second vision and value, and this is really critical, is that there's consistency in program administration across the state. One of the things we saw last year as we had the dollars out in local communities is that we had a lot of different approaches to administering the funds and everyone was scrambling. We were all in crisis mode. We saw incredible heroic work being done, but we also saw a real array of different approaches that communities were taking. Some were focusing on paying arrearages, some were focusing on paying future rent, some were focusing on 1 month at a time and having folks come in with different kinds of formats and forms. With the lift that we have in place with $204 million that we're looking to administer in just the next few months, it's critical that we have a consistency of program administration across the state so there's clarity for all parties involved, not only the families and the households that we're trying to serve, but all the many stakeholders who are invested in this program's success, that we have clarity and consistency, and that we can then, of course, meet our requirements as a grantee of the US Treasury to be able to report out on these funds. So we're looking for consistency of program administration across the state. The third one is clear and consistent information for clients and the public. There are multiple rental assistance programs already operating. We also know that jurisdictions are getting their own allocation from the US Treasury for this emergency rental assistance program. Larger cities and counties in the state of Oregon had the ability to apply for their own resources. So the city of Portland, Multnomah, Clackamas, Washington, Marion, and Lane counties are all getting their own allocation of funds from US Treasury. So to the extent possible, the funds that we will be administering, we want to have clear and consistent information for clients and the general public. And our hope is that we can also collaborate with those local jurisdictions receiving their own Treasury dollars so we can have clarity in how folks can find out information about these resources, where to go for that information, waiting lists, all sorts of other related matters. We can have clear and consistent information and communication because folks are experiencing trauma right now, and we don't need to add to that trauma with folks kind of getting different information at different turning points. We need to have a clear and consistent vision and communication on these programs. Next, equity and racial justice. As you heard Director Bell mention, we know that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic and the economic fallout. And so we have a commitment to making sure that we are expressly serving communities that are disproportionately impacted. That includes undocumented households, that includes doing affirmative outreach to BIPOC communities, making sure that we're reaching folks that may not have historically been reached by these kinds of programs. And then importantly, also centering the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color tenants so that we're hearing their experiences. That includes understanding the challenges that they're facing today, and maybe understanding as well what worked and what was a challenge in the crisis response that we all mounted last year so that we can learn from that. And then the next item is really around stabilizing households and taking a holistic approach. We're excited that this resource includes not only rental assistance, but utility assistance. And to the extent possible, we would love for households to be able to come to their service provider and receive both kinds of assistance in one fell swoop, rather than needing to go into one door for rental assistance and one door for utility assistance. We want to be able to help households to catch up, be made whole, and look forward. And when we talk about stabilizing households, that's part of our vision here as well, is that if we can not necessarily try to spread the peanut butter so thin that every family is getting a little bit of resource, or maybe 1 month versus of resource to pay down their arrears, but really looking at bringing households current. And that may mean that we're serving fewer households, but with a more meaningful attempt to stabilize folks and bring them current on their expenses. So that's really what we're looking at in terms of stabilizing households and taking a holistic approach. We can go to the next slide. What is our role as OHCS? Our role is really to see where we can add value in our role as the statewide vantage point and convener. One of the things I wanted to make clear that you'll hear about more on today's webinar is that the administration of this program, again, will look a little bit different than what you saw in the programs that were rolled out last year. We are looking at procuring a software solution that all of our sub-grantees will use so that folks are putting information into one portal in one place in a consistent fashion. That will certainly help when we need to do all the robust reporting up to the federal government. But we also think it will help with that consistency of program administration, the clarity. And then as we roll out software, we can also provide the training and assistance for our sub-grantees to be able to use that system. And we'll be also taking on the burden of federal compliance. The other piece I already mentioned was around communications. If we can help pull together information from the various sub-grantees and the jurisdictions administering this program to help have that clarity of communication, we think that we can add value there. And then also convening partners, folks that are administering these programs, to make sure that all of you out there, as you're administering these dollars, are able to learn from each other and share information on what's going on the ground. The next vision and value here, this is absolutely critical, and I want to be crystal clear, is that we are, as a state agency, our charge is to serve all corners of the state. We know that folks are hurting in rural Oregon and urban communities as well. So what we're striving for here, and part of the information that we need to glean from this RFI, is who is ready, willing, and able to serve all the various geographies of the state. We want to make sure that we have partners engaged in all corners of the state of Oregon, and all communities are served. So part of what we're trying to understand here is the lay of the land in terms of geography. We know that we worked with community action agency partners. We also know that they're very strapped. So we really want to get a clear understanding of who's ready to come to the table. And then we also need to be mindful of jurisdictions that received their own allocations from US Treasury. As I mentioned, folks did receive their own allocations. We don't quite understand the formula that the US Treasury used in making those allocations. And so we also want to hear from those jurisdictions what their need is, what their readiness is. And we'll be talking a little bit more about allocations later, but we can imagine that we need to be mindful of the needs in those communities as well. So we're trying to really hold all of that together. Our vision and value here is also to retain dollars in Oregon. There's a specific provision with these dollars that there's a spending and obligation deadline of September 30th of 2021 that is coming up very, very quickly. And there's a provision in the statute that grantees, so that includes us as the state agency, grantees that spend 65% or more of their Treasury allocation by September 30th are then eligible to receive additional dollars that will be recaptured from other communities that don't meet those spending targets. And if we're below that 65% threshold, then we risk losing the additional 35% of those dollars, and they will be stripped from us and reallocated to other states or jurisdictions potentially. So obviously one of our values here is to move with great expediency to make sure that we are not being frugal with spending dollars on households that need the resource, and providing that technical assistance to roll out the program effectively so that we can meet those spending deadlines. And then the final bullet point is really the take-home point, which is we need to balance the expediency and the great speed of this program with also being intentional around how we design programs to be as effective as possible, to reach the folks that need help, to be holistic, to serve communities of color, and do all of that intentional work. So that's a tall order, but we're up for the challenge. And I think with that, we are ready to move into a little bit more detail on the ERA program. So I will hand it over to Sam Kenny.
Thank you very much, Director Salazar. So once again, my name is Sam Kenny, and I am the Homeless Services Policy Analyst. It's really great to be with you all this morning. Thank you so much for joining. So you have heard from Assistant Director Lean, Director Bell, and Director Salazar about our vision, a high-level overview, and the purpose of the RFI. So I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through some of the program details as we understand them so far. So as many of you know, the name of the game during COVID response has really been flexibility and adaptability. And that really certainly continues to be the case regarding this emergency rental assistance program. So we know that details will continue to develop. As you will hear us reference several times, we're definitely waiting on updated Treasury guidance. But in service of supporting the applications for the RFI, we want to provide as much up-to-date information as we can. So please bear with me for a few minutes if this gets a little bit detailed, but as Laura talked about in the beginning, this webinar will be posted for reference as well, and you'll be able to access the slides there, and we want to make sure folks are up to date as possible. So to start off, let's talk about the eligible activities for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. All in all, they're pretty straightforward. The legislative intent of these funds is really to meet rental and utility assistance needs for folks who require assistance due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as many of you know too well, there's really a huge need for assistance. So we're really truly grateful to have this level of resource in the state of Oregon right now. So high level, these funds can be used for rent, rental arrears, utilities, and utility arrears. Rent and rental arrears are pretty straightforward. But to talk a little bit more about utilities, according to the Treasury, utilities include electricity, gas, water, sewer, trash removal, energy costs, and fuel. But not as of right now, telecommunication services such as telephone, cable, and internet. So we will, of course, continue to update folks if we receive different information, but just wanted to be very clear about what utilities mean in this program. So these are really the primary categories per the program intent, and at least 90% of the funds must be spent on these activities, with some flexibilities allowed for other expenses related to housing due to the pandemic. This latter part still needs to be fully defined by Treasury, but it can include housing stability services and case management. Director Salazar talked a little bit about timing, but I want to get a little bit more in depth around the program details of timing. So these funds can be paid up to 12 months per household, and that could mean 6 months arrears and 6 months advance rent. However, there is a focus on clearing arrears first. So really looking to try to make people as whole as possible. And then there's also an additional provision in the Treasury document so far that allows a grantee to provide assistance for an additional 3 months, so a total of 15 months, only if it is necessary to ensure the household remains stably housed and if funding is available. So there's sort of a soft deadline on 12 months of assistance, a hard deadline, a hard limit on 15 months of assistance. Next slide, please. So moving on, I'm going to highlight a few key details around household eligibility for these funds. First off, all renter households with incomes of no more than 80% of the area median income who meet the following definitions or the following caveats are eligible. And those are that one or more individual in the household has qualified for unemployment benefits, or several other details that you can see there on the slide. So generally this has experienced economic hardship from COVID, and one or more individual in the household can demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. So this is not fully defined yet, but a few examples could include a past due utility or rent notice, or documentation of unsafe or unhealthy living conditions. Additionally, the Treasury guidance right now allows for any other evidence determined by the eligible grantee, which in this case is OHCS. So we have not made final determinations on the additional evidence allowable, but we'll be looking into providing additional guidance soon. But broadly, the eligibility is 80% AMI, impacted by COVID economically and at risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. So in addition to that broad criteria, the Treasury also requires prioritization of 50% AMI or below, and households that have at least one unemployed member. So as of right now, the details of finalizing that prioritization are up to the grantee. Again, that's OHCS. So we're definitely working on providing additional guidance, but I think it's important to keep in mind right now some of these main targets we have. And then lastly, around eligible activities, and this is true for our federal programs as well as our state programs, we will work very closely with the subrecipients to ensure that there's no duplication of benefits. So we want the largest number of folks to receive the support that they need. And this is also a requirement of the federal program. So we'll definitely be looking into this and monitoring this as well. Next slide, please. So another key point of interest for anyone thinking about or working on completing the RFI is often the reporting requirements. So what is required? So this is a list of the reporting elements thus far. This is a relatively dense slide, so apologies for that. So I'm not going to read them out to you, but I want to make a few comments. So this list is definitely subject to change according to new guidance. And you'll notice that at the bottom, the data is required to be disaggregated by gender, by race, by ethnicity, all of the primary applicant. It's plausible that this could be across all applicants in the household. So just sort of keeping in mind that there may be additions to this list, but this is the list as we know it so far. You will also notice that the requirements have a focus on income. So I want to touch briefly on income eligibility documentation. So we have two key pieces of guidance so far. And one is that in order to confirm eligibility, grantees should primarily consider household income for the year of 2020. However, if that's not available for everyone, it's possible to provide confirmation of the monthly income that the household is receiving at the time of application. However, that would require some recertification. So as we're sort of thinking about what will it take to administer this program, that eligibility reporting requirements and then eligibility documentation are extremely critical. And then lastly, you will note that the guidance so far, and it's not on this slide, it does not specify a specific software in which the data needs to be collected. So for example, HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System, is not required explicitly for the ERA program. However, that is what we use often for many housing stability programs in the state of Oregon. So what this does is it leaves the door open for other possibilities and doesn't necessarily limit service providers that do not have HMIS access. And as Director Salazar spoke to, this potentially means exciting opportunities with new software and different formats of implementation. So we are definitely looking forward to following up with more details on the specific implementation of additional software and the reporting requirements. Next slide, please. So some of this is a little bit of a review, so I'll move through it fairly quickly so we make sure and finish all of our content today, but moving on to the high level fiscal requirements and some timeline information that we are looking at the state level. And there's really that important call out that Director Salazar spoke to as well, is that 65% of the emergency rental assistance funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2021, or the Treasury Department can recapture those funds not obligated by grantees, and we won't be eligible for additional funds. So needless to say, we are laser focused on making sure that all ERA funds come to OHCS to stay in Oregon, that come to Oregon, stay in Oregon, and are dispersed to everyone seeking assistance. So this time frame and timeline is something that we're looking at closely and monitoring closely and are really committed to meeting. A more general note on timeline, you will recall that I spoke that 12 months of assistance can be allowed per household, and these will end on December 31st, 2021. So that is the projected end date of the program right now. So if someone receives rental arrears assistance, they can still pay up to December 31. If it doesn't go over the 12 months, that's the soft limit. And then of course, there's the hard limit of 15 months and contingent on funding availability. So we are continuing to plan, of course, but these timelines are definitely informing that planning and implementation process. Next slide, please. And again, this is a little bit of review, but I want to take a step back and highlight some key program details and consider the broader emergency rental assistance program funding picture. So as Director Salazar mentioned, this is not OHCS is not the only recipient in the state of Oregon. So grantees eligible for ERA funds included local governments with population above 200,000. And this includes cities and counties, and there was an application process in January. So statewide, all grantees in Oregon received approximately $280 million in emergency rental assistance for 2021. The grantees outside of OHCS include Portland, the metro area counties, as well as Lane and Marion counties. and all of which received a direct allocation from the Treasury. These add up to approximately $76 million, and then OHCS received the rest to administer to the state at around $204 million. And as both Director Bell and Director Salazar mentioned, these funds are different from the coronavirus relief funds from the CARES Act in 2020. Those funds were administered by the Department of Administrative Services and received direction from the Oregon State Legislature on program intent. Whereas these funds are directly allocated to OHCS, which really places a additional emphasis on the federal legislative program intent and the administration of these funds. So we're definitely looking forward to continuing to follow that guidance and build their guidance into our program implementation. And then lastly, going back to that $204 million and $76 million breakout, even though the several other jurisdictions received direct allocations from Treasury, the amounts are really not commensurate with the demand for assistance. So we know that the allocations received by some counties directly are not sufficient to meet all of the needs in those communities. So we definitely recognize this and are looking to factor this into the ultimate allocation of funds. And so for more on this discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Director of Research, Megan Bolton, to talk more about our regional allocation process.
Great, thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. This is Megan Bolton, Assistant Director for Research and Analysis. And as Sam mentioned, I'm just going to briefly talk about our initial thinking for the allocation formula for these funds. As we do with all of our allocation formulas, we try to focus in on where the needs are greatest. And we want to match our allocation formula factors with the intent of the program, with our values and vision, and with eligibility requirements. So in the case of this program, some of our preliminary thoughts on need factors that will probably be used in this formula include looking at renter households at or below 80% of AMI, since that is part of the eligibility requirements. We will be looking at things like severe rent burden, particularly for low-income households, because we know that that leads to housing, or that is a key factor in housing instability. We'll also be taking a look at things like low-wage job loss due to COVID, which is a factor we've used in a couple of other formulas and comes from a tool that Urban Institute created that helps states and local governments prioritize funds. And we've also pulled in unemployment data from Oregon's employment department, which is another factor we could be looking at. And as both Director Salazar and Director Bell have mentioned, we are prioritizing equity, and we want to ensure that where there are high numbers of Black, Indigenous, and people of color renters, that we are getting funds to those locations. A newer factor that we haven't necessarily used before, but that we're thinking about using for these funds is energy burden, since these funds can be used for utility assistance. It's something that we're going to take a look at. Other factors that we've used in previous formulas include things like number of people in poverty, number of people on public assistance, homelessness. So we're still sort of figuring out the details, but we are working on that quickly and pulling the data together. And we'll ensure that our final allocation formula, including the factors and the weights, will be in the RFA. One of the things that Sam mentioned and others have mentioned as well is this the geographic considerations and the regional component of the allocations. We will be pulling all of the data for these factors that we mentioned at the county level, and we will be able to sort of aggregate that to any region that ends up making the most sense. And I think that's one key component, as Sandra will get into later, of the RFI. We'll be really interested to see how, like which counties people are saying they're going to be serving, who they're going to be working together with, et cetera, so that we can really start to zero in on what regions make the most sense for this allocation formula. But again, as others have mentioned, we know that there are some jurisdictions who received their own direct award, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't include them in our formula. We know, for instance, that I think Portland received somewhere around 8% of Oregon's funds, but they have somewhere closer to 25% of Oregon's renters. So we'll be taking that into consideration as we look at our formula. and thinking about the best way to ensure that sort of geographic equity that Director Salazar was speaking about. And that's it for me for now, and happy to answer questions later. And with that, I'll pass it on to Assistant Director Lean.
Thanks, Megan. Appreciate all the insight there. I just want to, before we jump into the technical aspects of the request for information, I wanted to just touch on a couple of for your informations, and RFI FYIs is a mouthful, but we thought it might get a laugh or not. Anyway, the eligibility of the RFI respondents is very similar to our other federal rent assistance and utility assistance programs. The one caveat here, and this is actual US Treasury guidance and requirements, is that these respondents must have experience running rent and utility assistance programs. So anyone that does not already have that particular expertise or has not led a program in the past it is not necessarily eligible for the funds through the RFA. We'd still like to hear from you, however, in the RFI. And we ask you to outline some of those specific experiences that you've had as a provider. Also, the RFI is open to any respondent who is a public or private nonprofit. This could be homeless services providers. This could be faith-based organizations. There's a wide net to cast with public and private nonprofits, and also entities of local government. So those who have already received other federal funds for rent assistance or utility assistance are still eligible to respond to our RFI so that we can understand more about what's happening in the great state. Also just wanted to touch quickly on provider preparedness. And so there is a lot of moving parts to this particular program, and there's a lot of information that we currently have and a lot of information that we do not currently have. And as has been mentioned several times, we are awaiting more formal guidance from the US Treasury on the operation and the implementation of this program. But so far, what we've been able to glean from their current guidance is there are several things that providers will need to be prepared for. One is capacity. So as you're thinking about the RFI, we really want you to be thoughtful about the previous rent assistance or utility assistance programs experiences, and to be thoughtful about what you might be able to take on as a potential grantee of these funds. There are a lot of programs out there right now. There have been a lot of stimulus packages that have been passed in the last year. And so we are really, really curious and want to learn more about the capacity that exists in the state to move these funds efficiently and effectively. Also consider the type of applicant you might be. And so will you collaborate in a regional way, or will you submit an independent application as a standalone provider? We don't necessarily require either. We are interested in learning more about potential collaborations. And so part of this RFI also would allow you to start those conversations early with any potential joint applicants. So if you think you might want to collaborate on the RFI, we would very much encourage you to start talking through those partnerships and creating those partnerships very early. We also want you to be prepared and thoughtful about the ERJ impact. So as has been mentioned several times, there is a disproportionate impact of COVID and housing instability, particularly on our communities of color and also across our rural areas of the state. So as you're working on and reflecting on the questions in the RFA and you're considering how that might translate to a request for applications or an RFA, think about how you might support the ERJ or equity and racial justice values and the goals that were also outlined in our vision and value statements as a state organization. And technology. So as has been mentioned also several times, we are providing a software system for the streamlining of applications across the state for this particular program. And so as we are providing that system, we will need to be thoughtful and considerate of what our new grantees or what our current grantees will need to be successful in using this new platform. So we are in active discussions around connection points with HMIS, or the Homeless Management Information System. We're also wanting to be really thoughtful about any kind of onboarding or training that would be required to be able to use this system. And with that, I will pass it to Sandra, who will talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of the RFI itself.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Sandra Flickinger, and I'm the Assistant Director of Procurement and Grant Compliance. And I'll be presenting a little bit of information in regards to the request for information that was issued by Oregon Housing on February 5th. The RFI was issued to obtain information from service providers that have experience administering an emergency rental assistance program. The difference between an RFI and an RFA is the RFI is mainly for information gathering, but the RFI information that we do obtain will be used to help develop a request for application or an RFA, which will disperse the federal grant funds to those experienced organizations that apply. So responses to the RFI will be used for general information purposes only and will not be considered binding on any party. Next slide, please. So as you've heard throughout the presentation, OHCS really does encourage a collaborative approach to meet the qualifications of grant funding. However, it's not a requirement. Respondents to the RFI must provide a description of relevant experience for their organization and any partner organization if it's a collaborative effort. So the experience should be in relevance of the RFI, and the respondents must use attachment B, which is a cover sheet, to describe each relevant engagement. Respondents must also provide a narrative, a written response responding to each of the questions listed in section 5.0 of the RFI, which is titled the RFI questions. And those narrative responses should be limited to 3 pages or 6 double-sided pages. Next slide. So responses to the RFI are due at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Monday, February 15th. And all responses should be submitted to ohcs.contracts@oregon.gov. And all electronic submissions must be received and time-stamped by or before the 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time deadline. The RFI document is going to be available and is posted actually on both OHCS procurement pages and the ERA program web pages on our OHCS website at www.oregon.gov/OHCS. So that is all I have for the RFI details at this time. I'll now hand it back over to Director Salazar.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We appreciate that. So rounding out our presentation, just a couple of pieces of information about what's next. So there will be some opportunities for folks to engage in and learn more about this program. We have a subcommittee of the Housing Stability Council that has been convened by our chair, Claire Hall. We will be meeting this Friday at 10 a.m. That will be open to the public to view. And we will be presenting the subcommittee with some information about the 2020 rental assistance that we've mentioned a couple of times, what we learned, what we experienced there, and trends there. And then we will go into more detail building on what you just heard from Megan Bolton around regional allocations and what those considerations will look like, what kinds of formula data we'll be looking at, and getting some input from our council on that matter. We know that's of great interest to folks. We may have more meetings of that subcommittee at the direction of our chair. I expect that we will also be discussing this program at the March Housing Stability Council regular meeting, which is on the first Friday of every month. And then just to be clear, again, we really want to encourage you to return this RFI with a response. Your responses will really help us understand our next steps and the opportunities and options in front of us. So the more we hear from all of you, the more informed our process will be. And the next slide. And then a little bit else about the next step. So while we were running this RFI process, we were also actively working on building out a software solution, as we've mentioned. Those of you that have been following the Landlord Compensation Fund would be interested to know that we're essentially building out a module from the software that we're launching for that program. So it's an add-on, and many state housing agencies and local housing agencies around the country have been using this kind of a software system for emergency rental assistance. And so there's a lot of groundwork has been laid for this kind of a software approach. On the RFI and RFA process, as you heard, the deadline is coming up on next Monday. We will be quickly reviewing the RFI responses and then turning around a request for applications to ensure coverage across the state. And again, depending on what we find out from the RFI will really determine how much, what goes into the RFA. But we are hoping to turn around grant agreements very quickly. We're hoping that the RFA will go out live at the end of February and to be able to execute grant agreements by the end of March to really have several months to be able to operate this program. And then certainly once we do execute those grant agreements, we will have ongoing training and onboarding of all the folks that will be administering this program. And I believe that rounds out our presentation, and we know that you're eager to ask us questions. So I will now turn things over to our moderators. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much to everyone for bearing through what has been a wealth of information this morning. So once again, Sam Kenny here with the Homeless Services section. So I know that folks have been chiming in on the chat, and we really appreciate your engagement so far. All of the questions we're getting helps us focus our thinking and information sharing. Likely we will not be able to get through all of the questions today, but as we have mentioned, there are still additional details forthcoming, and we will do what we can to address questions in this FAQ session. And then also, just as a reminder to everyone, the link to the recording will be posted on our webpage, in addition to other emergency rental assistance program resources, which if we haven't shared that link in the chat yet, I believe we will share that. And then we can also certainly will be included here at the end of the slide deck, and so you can find more information there. So with that, let's start moving through some of the questions. One of the first questions we received was just around accessing this information. So as I just talked about in terms of seeking this information on our website, the follow-up webinar, and in additional links, we'll make sure that those get posted and that everyone has access to those. And then I think on this one, jumping right into a very great question, a good specific question around program details and guidance. And so I think, Laura, I'm going to go ahead and pass this one over to you. And the question is, will 1099s need to be filed by subgrantees for recipients of these funds? So getting towards that income eligibility documentation. And then the questioner asks, this could be a barrier to serving undocumented folks, if so. So would you be able to speak for a few minutes a little bit more on that income documentation, such as we know it so far?
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. Thank you for that. I think this is an interesting question, and it's a really good question. And frankly, there are some elements of this question that we're still awaiting guidance on from the U.S. Treasury. But what we have been able to understand from their current FAQ and guidance is that income verification is prioritized from the 2020 annual income of anyone seeking services, and could potentially include a snapshot method of the last 30 days of income. So if an organization were to provide a 2020 income statement, they don't have the need to then revalidate or re-verify eligibility for the service of rent assistance, rent arrears, or energy assistance or arrears. The one thing that we're obviously we're prioritizing is the ability to be able to serve undocumented individuals that reside within Oregon. And so from an application standpoint, we're considering how some of that information might be gathered. And it's a little bit tricky at this point as we're awaiting guidance from the federal government as to whether or not undocumented status could be compromised with the reporting requirements of this program. So we're working really hard on determining that particular requirement. But basically, what I can tell you specifically is that a 1040 form could be filed as a potential evidence for 2020 annual income. But it could also be a wage statement, interest statement, or unemployment compensation statement if you do the snapshot method. So I hope that answers that particular question. And obviously, I think in most of these responses, there will be more information to come as we learn more from the U.S. Treasury.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. Super helpful. We've also received a couple good questions, more specifically around the RFI itself. So Sandra, I'd like to direct this question to you. And the question is, will partners in this program be characterized as sub-awardees or contractors? And the questioner states that this is relevant for regulatory compliance and whether partners have to undergo a uniform guidance audit. So if you could speak to a little bit more as to sort of the characterization under the RFI and RFA as to, their relationship to OHCS.
Sure, Sam, thank you. Great question. These are federal pass-through funds, so the relationship will be considered a sub-grantee relationship. And because of that relationship, the federal guidelines and requirements do pass down to the subrecipient, sub-grantee and subrecipient level. So there will be a requirement for audit if the entity receives more than $750,000 in total of federal grant funds. So there are some federal stipulations that will be required to be compliant with under that relationship.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandra. Appreciate that. Another question we have received is around sort of those allocations, the data, and the regions. And so, Megan, I'd like to pass this question to you. Is how will the geographic distribution goal interact or influence anticipated needs-based allocation? So I think just a little bit more clarification on kind of what a needs-based allocation looks like and how that combines with geographic distribution and geographic equity.
Great. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam, for the question. I think, as Director Salazar mentioned, we'll be getting a lot more into the allocation discussion at our Special Housing Stability Council meeting on Friday. So I think more to come on this, but the idea, and this is what we actually did with the ESG CV funds last year, is that we would sort of run our needs-based formula for all counties, really, including those that receive their own direct award. And we would then take into account how much their direct award was and sort of perhaps if we would have expected them to get more, bring them up to that level based on the needs that we see from the factors that we choose. And again, I think we're still kind of working out what those regions or geographic locations would be, but we will be basing it on county kind of needs data. So I hope that helps a little bit. And again, I think more to come on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. That was very helpful. We've also received a lot of great questions here kind of around ALITA and kind of what the new software might look like and some of the capabilities and or details around that. So I would just say up front, this is definitely, there's more information to come on this, and we are actively working on finalizing some of these details. But I think a few questions have come in, we can sort of provide some information on. So Laura, I think I'll pass these questions to you. And specifically, one of the questions is, won't your ALITA software capture the demographic information required, or will it simply be used to scan for duplicate payments? And then I think a follow-up question to that is sort of a little bit of discussion as to whether or not this connects with HMIS now, or kind of what that might look like. And so it's sort of a general discussion around data that might be captured in ALITA, how it connects with existing system, and our thinking from there.
Those are really great questions. Appreciate that, Sam. So the ALITA software is indeed able to capture demographic data. And so part of the nice element of that particular system is that it does help alleviate burden, both on the organization or the subrecipient side and the applicant side. And so it's intended to be kind of a one-stop shop application process for clients to receive rent or utility assistance or arrearages funding as quickly as possible. And so, as Sam mentioned, we're in pretty close talks with the ALITA software development team, and they are working on a solution that will work for what we need in Oregon in particular. And so one of those elements is the connection to our homeless management information or HMIS system. And we're in conversations with that, knowing that many of our potential subrecipients of these federal funds may desire to or require the use of HMIS in their own data reporting needs. And so we are working with the ALITA team to determine a way that those ALITA data sets, that those actual data sheets can be imported directly into the HMIS system. There is more information to come on, or I guess more detail to come on that, as we're still working out the nitty-gritty on that in particular. But generally speaking, yes, the ALITA system should gather the majority of the reporting requirements that the US Treasury is currently asking for. And that is also an intent for us to streamline and remove barriers to the subrecipients that will be providing this funding to clients across the state. So the benefit there is that we're looking at less data entry from the partnership standpoint, but we are really concerned and dedicated to ensuring that the systems talk together, or at least have that mechanism, and that we are reducing any duplication in data entry that would be required. So I think I got all of those questions, Sam, but if not, please let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. And I think if there's anything else to add from the leadership team around ALITA, appreciate you jumping on in.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sam. And just one quick thing to add, just to expand upon what Laura had mentioned, is I know that it is daunting, particularly now in crisis response, to talk about a new software system that seems unfamiliar. But one thing I would just throw out for community to be aware of is the ALITA software. They are actively working and have extensive experience with working with US Treasury and US Treasury programs. I believe the ALITA software right now is working with 18 other states on this very program. And so there are certainly some components that we need to crosswalk with HMIS and our own software. But in terms of running tenant-based programs, familiarity with tenant-based programs, and then I think more importantly, familiarity with federal requirements, the ALITA software is well-versed in that. So I would add that bit of confidence just to add for community to be aware of, because there certainly were some initial questions that we have, but I hope that gives folks a little bit more confidence for now until we get into more specific discussions around the software and the capabilities thereof.
Thank you, Director Bell, for that clarification. And I think I have another question that's come up, and I think I'll point this question right back to you again here, is around sort of the administration. So 90% of these funds need to go for direct service to clients, and then 10% indirect admin is allowed. And sort of a question around, will OHCS allow program administration delivery costs for providers, and what percent of that 10% admin allowed will be available to service providers?
Sure. So thank you for that question. I will start off. So for administration, the federal government is allowing for 10% in direct costs, so no indirect cost. For subgrantees, 8.5% admin will be allowable and available to subgrantees.
Thank you, Director Bell, for the clarification on that. And so we've received a couple other questions, and I think, Laura, I'm going to point these in your direction, is kind of around, would an organization be able to work both on this program from the OHCS pot of funds, if you will, as well as a city and county that received a direct allocation from the Department of Treasury? So as I mentioned sort of in our presentation today, and I think was brought up several other times, is we're definitely still working on this, but if you could speak to a little bit about what that might look like and some of our thinking around making sure that there is enough funds to cover the needs in specific areas.
Sure, happy to touch on that. And as Sam mentioned, this is still kind of an ongoing Treasury guidance, kind of a wait and see for us. But generally speaking, with our regional allocation formulas, we are looking at ensuring that jurisdictions are made whole with this money, or as whole as we can make them with the $280 million that the state received. So to that point, we know that there were certain regions and certain cities of our state that received direct allocations from the US Treasury specific to emergency rental assistance. What we are doing in our funding formula conversations is really working to elevate those particular direct allocations to ensure that it is enough according to our funding formula factors for that particular area. And so that's where those factors come into play. And Megan can talk more about that if there's additional questions on that, and there will certainly be more to come from the OHCS side. I think the one thing we would really encourage is if there is two pots of money coming from the same government entity, so in this case, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we would encourage collaboration, certainly, so that those dollars can be pooled and used for a broader reach. I think the one big caveat to that is that the US Treasury has requested that to the extent possible, we reduce duplication of benefits. So there would have to be a mechanism on the subrecipient side to ensure that those duplications are not occurring across both of those pots of funds that might be shared in collaboration with each subrecipient. So I'm hoping that makes sense, but if not, let me know if there's a follow-up question to that.
Thank you, Laura. A couple other really good questions we've had rolling in around the RFI and a little more what that means. And so Sandra, I'm going to direct these questions to you. And one of the questions is an RFI response a necessary precondition for replying to the potential RFA, or is the RFI response optional?
Yeah, great question. So the RFI is not a required, you don't have to submit a response to the RFI. However, we are highly encouraging submission of response to the RFI because that will help inform the request for application or the RFA of which the funding will be dispersed through. So we want to make sure that we are aware of all the needs and gaps that are within the regions to be able to really have a clear and complete request for application. So again, it's not, an RFI response is not required, but we do highly encourage that you submit those responses.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Another question we have received in sort of body of questions, and Laura, I might direct this to you, but we'll definitely open it up for anyone else who has insight on this or thoughts on this, is sort of around generally, how is OHCS planning to prioritize around folks who are ineligible for unemployment? And so I think this is in response to some of the prioritizations as laid out by Treasury around 50% AMI or less, as well as folks who are unemployed. And yet we also know that there are folks who drastically need assistance and yet are not unemployed. And so it kind of gets to that question. And I mentioned as well that the state has prerogative around our prioritization. And so as we are thinking about what that looks like moving forward. So I don't think we're going to have a definitive answer right now, but I would like to open that up for a little bit of discussion and sort of feedback to this question.
Sure, I can start that. And then if Andrea or Margaret or anyone else has anything to add, I'd be happy to give the floor over. Generally speaking, the requirements from guidance or from the US Treasury is that they are prioritizing, or they're encouraging the prioritization of those categories that we mentioned in earlier slides. The reality of the situation, especially in Oregon, is that we have residents who may not have those levels of verification and or may not qualify for unemployment. So as a state, we are still working on determining those particular directions and those directives. And we are working also with our software platform company to determine how a prioritization process might work as those applications come in and as those documents are being requested on behalf of those applications. So the one thing I can mention is that we are really actively working on seeking community feedback and community engagement around this particular issue. OHCS has not yet landed on that particular stance, and we are still waiting on guidance, but we are committed to engaging with our partners to ensure that we are streamlining the process for both our subrecipients and the clients who need the assistance, and that we are reaching all parts of the state to ensure that all residents that need rent or utility assistance are being served adequately and appropriately with these funds.
Thank you so much, Laura. Moving on to another question, we received this. It's a great question, and I think it speaks to a bigger topic that is really important to us at OHCS and across all of the fund sources, the CARES Act, the Emergency Solutions Grants, COVID, and so forth. So specifically how it interplays with the emergency rental assistance, I think we are still kind of working on some of those details, but I'll open this question up again to the team here. And it's around OHCS's plan to build capacity to ensure equitable distribution of funds if we don't receive sufficient RFI responses. So we have this RFI out, we are looking to find more information about who is capable and able and ready to implement these funds. And if we don't receive the responses we need, what plans do we have to make sure that resources are equitably allocated and services can be provided throughout the state?
Sam, I will take a stab at answering that one because it's a great question. I think that's part of why we wanted to take the step of doing this RFI, because we know that folks are stretched and there's a lot of great work going on out there, and we wanted to make sure that we understood the lay of the land. So I don't think we have an answer yet on that question. What if we don't have coverage across the state? I just don't think we have an answer to that, which is why we need your help to make sure that we get responses so that we can really accurately get a picture of what's needed and where we may need to stretch and we create some new kinds of relationships or partnerships. So I just stay tuned. This is a live question, and we really want to see your responses to help us inform how we respond and move forward.
And maybe, Sam, I'll just add one thing to what Director Salazar had mentioned, which is that is one of the questions on our mind as well. And I would say that is exactly why we need this RFI. We do not want to make assumptions. We cannot make assumptions around provider capacity and around assumed coverage. It is our absolute goal that there will be dollars going across the state to ensure that there is geographic coverage. That is absolutely one of the fundamentals of our program, is that there is going to be no community left behind with the funding. I would say the other thing that I would highlight with this process is that this is also about transparency. We want to make sure that community has full sight of decisions that the state is making around rental assistance, but also around the structures of the program, so that if we have to go a route and the structure maybe looks a little bit different than we intended, or maybe that we hoped, that at least that there is transparency statewide around the why behind that. So we fully intend that once we have this RFI and we get the responses from folks that are interested in administering the program, we can then build out the next steps and identify what the path forward is, and quite frankly, not be in a vacuum around that, and just to ensure that there's transparency from the state to community about any decisions that are made.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that response. Hopefully that information was helpful and great question. We've also received a few other questions around utilities and kind of what that means. And so the rental assistance generally is a little bit more straightforward for folks, but I also know a lot of service providers out there are very, very knowledgeable about what it means to provide utility assistance as well. And obviously that's an incredibly important part of making sure someone is stably housed. So just to reiterate, utilities are an allowable expense, and the Treasury definition of utility thus far is electricity, gas, water, sewer, trash removal, energy costs, and fuel oil. And we can sort of link to the Treasury guidance on this so that we make sure that's clear. That's a lot to remember in the moment. Important call out is this does not include telephone, cable, or internet. Of course, during the new COVID world right now, when there's a lot, telephone, cable, and internet have never been more important than before. But that's sort of where we're at right now in terms of the guidance we have from the Treasury Department around what utilities are allowable for. Of course, if this changes, we will make sure that folks are able to access that information. Another question we have received, and this is sort of in the realm again of ALITA, of a centralized system, of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And as you heard Director Bell and Director Salazar talk in the beginning, this is one program out of many different pots of funding we have received, from the coronavirus relief funds to the landlord compensation fund, other programs. And so one of the questions we have received is how OHCS is going to make sure that landlords don't get duplicate awards from the landlord compensation fund, as well as just general comments around how to think about deduplication and the data sort of entering into ALITA. And so maybe first off, I'll direct that question to Laura, and then happy to open it up for more responses.
Thanks, Sam. This is a really good question, considering all of the different pools of rent or landlord compensation programs we have out in the state right now. So one important thing to note on the Landlord and Tenant Compensation Fund, or what we're calling in the Homeless Services section, the STAR program, or the Supporting Tenants Accessing Rental Resources program, which is the $50 million cut of the overall $200 million that went to the Landlord Compensation Fund. Those are state general funds. And so there is a little bit more flexibility around the use of those funds in terms of making landlords and tenants whole on any arrearages or any forward thinking forward rent assistance needs. So we are working actively on ensuring that there is a duplication process that we are examining internally between the Homeless Services section and the Affordable Rental Housing section, between the tenants and the landlords on that program. This is the exact same platform, or the ALITA platform, that we are proposing to use for the Emergency Rental Assistance application platform as well. So the good thing about that is that all of the data is being funneled into the exact same place, and that will make our ability to check for duplication of benefits so much more streamlined and easy on the user side. And so I think that's all I have to mention for that, but Sam, I might have missed another part of that question, or if anyone else wants to jump in and mention anything about duplication of benefits.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's you're right on, and there's certainly a fine balance between providing as much rental assistance and assistance generally as possible, and managing the programs and trying to sort of meet those expediency needs as well as intentionality needs. So really appreciate that. Another question we have received specifically around the RFI, and Sandra, I think I'm going to direct this one to you, and if not, we can open it up to the group, is whether or not this application process, the RFI or an RFA, will be open later in the year. Are we sort of time bound with that timeline that was presented in the slides today around over this next month, or would there be a separate reallocation later on at a different time period?
Yeah, so I can talk about the current RFAs. Director Bell had mentioned that this is a very aggressive time frame. We're really trying to get the funding out the door to the citizens of Oregon. So our hope is to have the RFA posted by the end of the month, and so we can get the grant awards out and issued by the end of March. I don't know, and maybe Assistant Director Lean can answer the possibility of opening another round of funding up. I'm not sure that that has been communicated.
Thanks, Sandra. That's a really good question, and I don't have an answer for that. The reality is we received this $204 million direct allocation from the U.S. Treasury to OHCS, and we are committed to getting those funds out as quickly as possible. And so to that extent, we are releasing all of those dollars through our RFA process, but that is also reliant on applicants coming into the fold and applying for those funds in every reach of the state. So to that note, and to just reiterate what Director Salazar had mentioned, there are still some details and processes that we need to work out internally in terms of what that allocation structure looks like, depending on who responds to the RFI and the RFA. So I just want to reiterate one more time that the RFI is extremely important to us to understand where that geographic reach is currently, to understand who is out there providing good services, who is already doing rent and utility assistance, services to clients, and who would be interested in receiving more dollars from the US Treasury through OHCS to be able to continue to serve the unprecedented need that we know the $204 million is still not going to cover. And I see Director Bell has jumped in too, so maybe there's more to add there.
Thanks, Laura. And I think I just broke a Zoom no-no with having the video on simultaneously, but I will just say that, so this is really pushing our own procurement processes, and I want to be really honest about that, but I think all for the right reasons. I think one of the options that we'd want to seek to explore, and so much of this, again, is you'll hear this running theme, so much of this is contingent upon the information that we get from community through the RFI process, is whether we have provider capacity during this first round, whether we have geographic coverage, and then to the question around reallocation and whether there's going to be another process. It may be that we have an allowability, and this is something that we would need to look into and verify, whether we could go back to applicants that came in through the initial RFI or RFA process. We were able to do something similar to that with our emergency solutions grant process for awardees to sort of tap into that existing capacity rather than running another program and knowing that there's time associated with that, and time is not necessarily on our side. So I will just say that there's no options off the table, and we are exploring alternative routes around reallocation and using our existing RFI and soon to be RFA process to help us determine our processes into the future around reallocation.
Thank you very much, Director Bell. Another question we have received, and I think, Megan, I'm going to point this your direction in terms of data and the allocation and the funding formula. And I think what the question is getting at is around sort of the likelihood that if we do a funding formula, that the areas that receive a direct allocation will get funds above and beyond their direct allocation. So given what we know sort of about overall statewide needs, how many funds came to OHCS directly, and the specific allocations received by several cities and counties. Megan, would you be able to talk at all kind of around, obviously not having the data yet, but some expectations of what that might look like in terms of statewide?
Sure. Sorry. Just forgot to turn my video on. Hi. I think hopefully I've sort of addressed this already, but to kind of go over it one more time, I think, we will, again, try to do our best to really use a formula that's needs-based and that ensures that funds go to areas with the most number of renters and households in need. And so, it earlier showed the slide of some of the factors that we're looking at. And, we certainly do see that some of the places that have received their own direct awards really do have highest numbers of renters, particularly severely cost-burdened low-income renters who have suffered a lot of job loss due to COVID, and where there are some high rates of renter households who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So because those are some of the primary factors that we'll take into account, it's very likely that we'll see that that some of the places that receive direct awards should probably have been given more funds according to our formula. And so we would work to ensure that those regions received enough, well, might never be enough, but hopefully more funding to meet the needs of their communities, while still ensuring certainly that that we're getting funds all across the state to all regions, because we know everyone is suffering, but we do want to ensure that in those places where we know there are high numbers of renters in need, that that those places are getting the funds that they need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the clarification. Another question here, and I think this is a really good question around sort of timing and immediate needs. And I think this, of course, is extremely important where we're towards the, the end of winter here, and preventing evictions is of utmost priority. So one of the questions is, how many months specifically will it take to issue money to landlords? And so, Laura, I'm hoping you can maybe speak to sort of existing resources, where we are at with other current funding programs, and a little bit about our timeline expectations moving forward, and interested to hear if anyone else has comments on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sam. So it's a really good question. And I think one thing I do want to reiterate, and as we stated in one of the first slides, is that there are other rent assistance programs that are already on the ground and are currently operational. Many of those have been extended through the end of this fiscal year. And so we still have coronavirus relief funds, federal dollars, that have been redistributed across our community action agency network. They are actively working with those dollars. The landlord compensation fund is also going live shortly. And so they are putting the finishing touches on the software system that we need to be able to direct those payments. But that is $150 million that is directly allowed to be applied for by landlords specifically. And we also have the STAR program, which is the Supporting Tenants Accessing Rental Resources program. And that's the other $50 million tranche of funding that we received from state general funds. And all in all, $40 million from the STAR program has already gone out to our community action agency network. That is also the counterpart to the landlord compensation fund. And I'm sorry, I said it's already gone out. They will be going out. And that particular program directly assists tenants, whereas the other $150 million directly assists landlords. One other thing I want to mention about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program from the U.S. Treasury is that landlords are eligible to apply for these funds on behalf of their tenants. And so there is a provision in there where the tenants will need to sign an affidavit or some other kind of eligibility form that identifies that their landlords are applying directly to this funding from our subrecipients. In the cases where a landlord might own multiple units or multiple buildings, this can be a way to streamline payments directly to landlords as well through this particular pot of funds. And that's $204 million. So all in all, we are looking to meet our funding deadline for the emergency rental assistance dollars at 65% spent out at the end of September. And so it's incredibly important that we get these dollars out quickly and as efficiently and expeditiously as humanly possible to ensure that both landlords and tenants are made whole on this.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate it. So I think we have time for about one more question. So I'll pose one more quick question here, but I will just also say we received a lot of really great questions. And so as Laura talked about in the beginning, we'll make sure and have an FAQ to follow up with this information, get the questions answered, and continue to sort of maintain some communication. So please visit those links to our website for the latest and final information. So last question here, and then we will turn it over to Director Bell to wrap up. Is whether or not 100% of these payments will be made to landlords or if payments are made directly to tenants as well. So sort of talking a little bit about the balance between a landlord assistance program and the tenant-based assistance program. So Laura, would you like to discuss that just for a minute or two before we turn it over to Director Bell?
Sure, absolutely. So are we talking, Sam, before you jump off your mute, are we talking about specific to the ERA program here?
Yes, I think so. So sort of in the program administration around the ERA, kind of what that looks like in terms of serving landlords and tenants, or just landlords or just tenants.
That's a really good question. And so the way that the Treasury guidance is written currently is that the payments go directly to landlords. So if a tenant applies for assistance, rental arrears or rent forward assistance or utility, oh, I'm sorry, not utility assistance, just rent assistance, those dollars go directly to the landlord to make that tenant whole according to what the landlord needs to pay off whatever rent is due. Utility assistance will be paid directly to utility providers. So I'm sorry for that confusion there. The one kicker is that if a landlord does not respond to the opportunity to receive those dollars from a client's application or a tenant's application, I think there's a 30-day window. And again, the Treasury guidance will clarify this more as it becomes official. there is a window where those dollars will instead go directly to the tenant who has applied for those funds. So the provision really is to the landlord directly, but there is a safeguard for the tenants as well on that side to ensure that the tenants are still able to make those rent payments if their landlord is not responsive to those dollars or to that application.
Thank you, Laura, for taking that last question. Sam, thank you for moderating all of the questions. And for all of you that are listening and participating today, thank you for being in virtual community with us today. Thank you for your service at the local level. We know that there continues to be ways of change and impacting. You all are much closer to this than us. So please reach out to us if you have any specific questions. We have our website information posted here. We will get a number of FAQs posted and updated over the next few days. In the meantime, please let us know how we can be of support. Please do not hesitate to reach out, give us feedback. There's no pride in authorship here, so just reach out to us if you need us. Intentionality. So we'll have a number of communication platforms available. Reach out to us if you need us. Thank you for being with us today, and we will talk soon. Take care.